The United Conservative Party has imposed a 6-month moratorium on green energy products, such as wind and solar projects here in Alberta, but it's come under a lot of criticism by the opposition NDP and some of the energy sector. However, the UCP is defending their decision. The UCP has also been very vocal about the federal government's 2035 net zero emitting electricity goal. So to break it all down a bit more, I'm going to bring in the MLA for Calgary Shaw, Rebecca Schulz, who is the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas. And she will discuss this a little bit better. She's joining me now from Calgary. Minister Schulz, thanks so much for being here today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so Ms. Schulz, I understand this moratorium, which has been making headlines all over the place. I understand that it wasn't necessarily your bill, but are you able to explain a little bit to our viewers kind of what it
Yeah.
entails? And maybe.
So that was a lead decision by the Minister of Affordability and Utilities, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you about that in detail. But just at high level, look, we saw 75% of Canada's investments in renewables. They were in Alberta last year. And I mean, this speaks to that free market, entrepreneurial spirit that Alberta is known for. We just saw huge growth. But with that, there were also concerns raised. So concerns around how do we make sure that there's reliability in the grid so that we're not faced with blackouts, right, in the middle of winter, making sure that people actually have access to power when we don't have renewables working, when the sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing. So that was one concern. Some others were about liability and reclamation. So what happens at the end of life of wind and solar materials? So what does that look like? With the rapid growth, we had to take a look at setting some of those parameters. There's going to be, I think, 4 or 5 ministries involved in that work. This was something in my formal role, Minister of Municipal Affairs. This was one of the top things I heard at the rural municipalities last 2 conventions. And so this is something that needs to be addressed so that we have certainty moving forward. So it's a 6-7 month pause. It allows us to put all of the right parameters in place so that we can move forward.
Okay, so is that mostly what the reason was before for implementing
Yeah.
that hold?
It
Okay.
was like, let's
Yeah.
get it right. Let's make sure that we have reliability and affordability in our electricity grid, and then also deal with those concerns around liability and reclamation. But also there was concerns raised about, where are we putting these, right? Let's make sure that we have a way to address the concerns around setting up solar or wind on some of our prime irrigated agricultural land. How do we balance that? And so that was really the list of considerations that led to that decision. I think some clarity on this will allow us to provide more certainty as we move forward.
And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be investing in those projects in the
Yeah.
future potentially, right?
Well, absolutely. Renewables are absolutely a part of our energy future and our electricity future. We've seen that huge growth. Like I said, I imagine we'll continue to see growth, but there's a couple of things that we had to address before we can move forward.
So, with all the criticism it's coming under, how is the party sort of reacting to that, responding to that? To the fact, I think one of the biggest criticisms is that there was no consultation made with with those in the energy sector. Is that true? And how is the party sort of reacting to that?
So I would say that this wasn't a surprise. Like I said, when I was in municipal affairs, serving as the minister there just before the election and leading up to the spring, this was one of the top issues that was raised at those conventions. And so we committed very publicly to bringing together a number of ministries to address these very issues. Again, it comes down to making sure that we have enough base load, so that we have reliability in our grid, that people have access to power when and where they need it, that we can keep power bills affordable, and that also we're dealing with end of life, liability, reclamation, also impacts to biodiversity, right? Whether that be birds, bats, and other animals. That's also something that was raised. And so we committed a number of times over the previous number of months in response to people who were asking for us to do this work, including the Rural Municipalities Association of Alberta. And so they were quite supportive, recognizing that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. We have to put some parameters around what's happening in this area. We still want to see renewable growth, and I believe that we'll still see investments in renewables as we move forward. This will allow us to have some more certainty as that work continues.
Okay, so is this government considering alternative renewable energy sources like hydroelectric or geothermal, even nuclear as alternative investments? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And so this actually leads into the discussions that we're having with the federal government around the clean electricity regulations, because our response last week when we saw the draft regulations, I mean, first of all, it was a lot of concern, right? This is a huge cost for taxpayers. Uh, Cost estimates have put this at over $1 trillion. $1.7 trillion is what one estimate has the cost of this plan put at. Somehow somebody is going to have to pay for it, and it's going to be Albertans and Canadians, either on their power bills or through their taxes, right? This is a huge amount of money in a short amount of time. There's a huge amount of infrastructure needed to even get there. A lot of the technology hasn't yet been tested or doesn't exist. And you're exactly right. For Alberta, this is not an either or discussion. We will continue to need natural gas, and that obviously is needed to make sure that we have base loads that people can in fact turn on their lights in the middle of winter. But that we also want to look at CCUS for natural gas, making sure that we have an opportunity to look at hydro. Obviously, we don't have the same level of hydro as some other provinces like Quebec, which puts Alberta, Saskatchewan, and some other provinces. I think there's 5 provinces now that have just said, wow, like this is near impossible. We don't have that hydroelectricity, but we would like to look at it. We'd love to look at small modular reactors. Premier has been very clear that our approach is to look at all the above. It's not an either or, and renewables will of course be part of our mix moving forward.
Okay, well, obviously you were talking about the federal government's net zero 2035 plan there, right? So that's that goal of 100% net zero emitting electricity system. That's in 12 years is kind of what that goal is. So now, Rebecca, you were one of the very first ones to jump on this and hold a press conference to announce that Alberta will not be taking part in this plan and that the province has its own plan. So do you want to maybe dive into that a little bit more? Do you think this 2035 deadline is unrealistic?
It is. It's completely unrealistic. It's also unconstitutional for the federal government to dictate to provinces how we meet our own goals and how we develop our resources and how we generate our power. But it's also completely unaffordable. So I've already spoken to that. Like, our concern here is that, I mean, we're here to represent Albertans. Reliability and affordability of our electricity is absolutely top of mind at a time when cost of living and inflation are the top issues for not only Albertans, but Canadians. How can we justify this exceptional cost, when we have a plan around carbon neutrality to get there by 2050 here in Alberta? We have our own plan, and that was released by my former colleague, Minister Sonia Savage, and the Premier just this past spring, saying, look, we care about the environment. We know we can reduce emissions without crippling our economy and driving away jobs. And so we're going to do this in our own way. What we're asking the federal government for is to have a reasonable, common sense discussion about this. The Premier has set up some working groups between the province and the federal government to address these issues. But I think it's frustrating then, as we're working to get these discussions rolling, that we see this first draft of the clean electricity regulations, which doesn't take into account any feedback that we in our province, whether that be government or much of the feedback from industry, has provided. So that's obviously exceptionally problematic. But we're going to continue to stand up for common sense and essentially, make sure that affordability and reliability are kept top of mind, no matter what.
Okay, so you're mentioning the provincial government had that 2050 goal. Was that a goal you already had set in mind before the federal government announced this 2035 goal?
Our industries have long said that, they've been doing exceptional work in reducing emissions. And so industry is doing this for a variety of reasons, investment, competitiveness. And so for us, it was about capturing, okay, what's happening here already? Have we articulated what's going on? And then recognizing that there are a lot of different ways that we can reduce emissions in a variety of industries, not just in our energy industry. Last week we were out at a cement plant with Heidelberg looking at their net zero cement pilot project, which is pretty exciting. So there are a lot of different ways that we can work to reduce emissions. A goal of 2050 is very reasonable. It's aligned with a number of other jurisdictions around the world. And, I just don't think that we can move to this 2035 arbitrary target with these massive costs to Albertans and Canadians, and especially when the reliability of our system is at risk. So, we'll start those conversations with the federal government, but, we really have to defend affordability and reliability for Albertans.
Okay, now the Alberta government has long fought back legally against federal rules that it doesn't like, and you've also passed the Sovereignty Act. So is there any way that we could see this act come into play here in regards to this net zero emissions?
The first thing Premier has said is, look, we're going to sit at the table and we're going to have these discussions. We need to talk through, and it's not just the clean electricity regulations that are problematic from the federal government. They have also publicly said that they are going to put an oil and gas cap and an emissions cap in place for our energy industry, which would essentially impact production. And again, that's an area of provincial jurisdiction that would have a huge impact on jobs, our economy, on entire municipalities and First Nations communities. That's also not something that we will accept. So those are the types of things that we're going to be discussing with the federal government. So we'll start there. I think what we saw 2 weeks ago now in this first draft of the regulations, that's not a great start. They have not taken our feedback, but we're going to start with discussions. And then following that, we're going to use every tool we've got to make sure that we're fighting on behalf of Albertans' best interests and making sure that the federal government isn't coming in and making life less affordable and risking things like rolling brownouts. I don't think that that's something that Albertans want to see. That's what I shared with Minister Guilbeault when we first met. I said, look, I don't think that the Albertans that we represent want to see drastic increases in their electricity bills and their power bills, and then risk rationing power or only being allowed to turn your lights on during certain hours or facing rolling brownouts in the middle of winter. I just don't think that that's something that Albertans want to see happen here. And so anything that would result in that is something we're not obviously going to sign on to.
Mm-hmm. And what was his reaction to that?
They said that they heard our feedback. And of course, this is a draft. This is draft one. My concern is when they haven't really done a lot of costing and looked at the socioeconomic impacts on a regional basis, that maybe it wasn't ready for a draft. But, now we have 75 days to make sure that we're doing that. We're doing that work. We're costing this. We're looking at our own electricity grid here in Alberta and what the impacts would be. We're getting feedback from industry. We'll be sharing that with the federal government. But you know what? We have to continue to defend Albertans. We just do. And right now, the way that this draft sits, that is a very real risk from a cost perspective and actually having a reliable grid. And, we do use that example of, like, think about that, right? In the middle of winter here in Alberta, when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining and it's frigid outside, you expect there to be power in your home.
Kind of, yeah.
Especially if you're paying exorbitantly higher costs for that power. That is just not something we can accept on behalf of Albertans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cost is a big thing for you, obviously. So how do you envision maintaining a balanced energy portfolio that includes both green technologies and traditional fossil fuels to ensure energy security and affordability for everyone?
And that's exactly what our emissions reduction and energy development plan is all about. That industry is working on technology and innovation. We also have a tier program here, which is the levy on heavy emitters. We take many of those dollars and invest them back into technology, innovation, and emissions reduction to reduce emissions. So that to me is the positive. Industry is already doing much of this work, and we want to make sure that we're supporting that work. And 2050, in terms of carbon neutrality, that's our aspiration here. That's a lot more reasonable goal than 2035. We still will need natural gas here in Alberta. And to really summarize, I mean, the federal government says, well, our draft regulations will still allow for natural gas. Kind of, right? Like, they've also put in place a provision for 20-year end of prescribed life. Who's going to invest in that type of infrastructure when it can only be used for 20 years? Right? Like, that just doesn't make sense. And you can't just build a natural gas facility, take it out of the cupboard, use it in the middle of winter when you don't have enough renewable baseload, and then put it back. Like, that's just not economical. It doesn't make any sense for companies to do that. And so what we're saying is we have a far more common sense approach where we can continue to see economic development, growth. We don't want to put people out of work. We don't want to essentially, phase out the livelihoods of entire communities. And that's what we're facing here with what the federal government has put forward. So we'll start with those discussions. But as Premier has said, like, we'll use every tool that we have to make sure that we're able to advocate for Albertans and look out for their best interests.
Thank you so much. It looks like we're out of time here, but Minister Schulz, thanks so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Rebecca Schulz is the MLA for Calgary Shaw and the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas.